There's a lot to criticize about the Rings of Power, and watching it I realized it doesn't offer the immersion and escapism that you are familiar with from other fantasy epics. For me it's clear, the Rings of Power doesn't qualify as a fantasy story. And you may think, what do you mean? It's a fantasy world with elves, mythical creatures and magic, therefore it must be fantasy. And you are right, but does this also make it a fantasy story? Today I want to look deeper into what is fantasy, and I will use the Rings of Power and the Lord of the Rings to understand what really makes a fantasy story. We all have an idea about what fantasy refers to as a genre. It is often associated with immersion and escapism. So I try to escape the world and immerse myself into the Rings of Power, which is advertised as the most expensive, biggest and best fantasy epic, based on the works of Tolkien. But soon I found myself escaping from that fantasy world and go back to reality. But why does it fail as a fantasy story? To answer this question, I want to quote Tolkien, often called the founder of modern fantasy. The story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it, while you are, as it were, inside. The moment this belief arises, the spell is broken, the magic, or rather art, has failed. So for Tolkien, fantasy is the creation of a fantasy world you can immerse yourself in. Within this world, what you create is law. And when this belief arises, the art, in this case the art of telling a fantasy story, has failed. Let's break this down into pieces. At first we have the creation of a fantasy world. This is arguably the easiest to uncover. The Rings of Power takes place in a fantastical world with elves, dwarves and other mythical creatures that has been created by Tolkien himself. And despite the critique about the lore changes the showrunners made, it still qualifies as a fantasy world. But as they changed the lore to fit the story they want to tell, they made a big mistake. And here we come to point 2. Within the world, what you create is law. While in the state of imagination, everything you think is law. But in the moment you bring the world from your imagination to paper, what is written down acts as an undeniable truth. See, a fantasy world is so much more than just a means to escape reality. A fantasy world is so great to tell a story because you can utilize all the unique features of this world to make a point that enhances the plot to a degree far greater than everything you could do in the real world. Fantasy, or to be more precise, the lore is necessary as a storytelling device when you make a fantasy story. The lore of a fantasy world is what truly distinguishes fantasy from other genres. Because the ground level of storytelling in all genres is similar, in a scene you need character development and drive the plot forward. But within fantasy you have a third component we were just talking about. You need to explain or hint at the lore of the world, which in return will complement the story. For a good example, look no further than the Lord of the Rings. The hobbits of Middle-earth show the small person in the world, figuratively and literally. They are the average person, those who work to earn a living and deal with their individual struggles and not with the issues of the world. And thereby Frodo embodies the story of the underdog that saves the world. Each piece of lore of Tolkien's world, carefully crafted and put together, leads up to a climax of an unprecedented form. For a lot of people, this is the pinnacle of storytelling, and that is one of the things that makes a fantasy story. In contrast, the writers of the Rings of Power do not only not use the lore to enhance the story, they change the lore to a point where it contradicts what it was supposed to mean. And thereby disbelief arises, and the art of telling a fantasy story has failed. Let's understand how this happens. In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron embodies everything evil in humans, and his followers, the orcs, were once humane creatures that were like him corrupted and bent to Melkor's will. They are not to see as a humanoid species, they are a caricature of the evil things that humans do and feel. The creators of the Rings of Power try to make a point about the perception of evil. There is no pure evil, which might be an interesting concept to uncover, but this is absolutely the wrong world, or at least the wrong lore to make this point. You could use the war between the Númenóreans and the Valar to make this point, which I'm sure will happen. But by giving the orcs humane traits, the personification of evil, you imply that fighting for good is wrong. As we are all capable of evil, it's our nature to fight the forces which try to corrupt us, and those who bring it upon us. Thereby not fighting for good contradicts our most inner values and thereby the spell is broken. But this is not the only thing that is important about fantasy. It's about the things that we know and don't know. With the things we know being the lore presented on screen. But sometimes the things we don't know are those who spark curiosity and creativity in those who experience the fantasy world and story. In The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is one of the Dunedain, who are the descendants of the people of Numenor when The Lord of the Rings take place. We don't know a lot about them, which gives Aragorn this mystery and the tragedy of the loss of his kind, which gives him purpose and creates curiosity within us. Numenor functions as this myth of a civilization of the past. In the Rings of Power, Numenor is shown in its whole glory, which takes away this mystery. I never had a perfect picture of who those people were, but my imagination was much better than what I saw on screen. A large part of fantasy is about the imagination. There are things that should be unexplained, but the authors and showrunners of the Rings of Power try everything to show us the things Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings kept in shadows. The Rings of Power leaves no mystery uncovered, no places unseen, and no character's backstory untouched. Everything in the fantasy world is as it seems or as exposed by the protagonists. The Rings of Power isn't a fantasy story, it's just a story that happens to be in a fantasy world. When there's one thing to take away from this video, fantasy is about escapism, a world that is beyond reality in which your mind can wander. But it is also about immersion and complementation of a story that delves into the deepest layer of your mind and gives you something to be taken away from this imaginary world to aid you. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, like and subscribe. And until we see us again, have a great time.